What happens when the very people entrusted with the authority over your community start demanding access to your private property, and then things go horribly wrong? What if that seemingly innocent request puts everything you've worked for in jeopardy, and you find yourself at the center of an unexpected nightmare? My name is Johnson, and I never thought I'd be in this situation. I always imagined my home would be a place of peace and security, a sanctuary away from the chaos of the world. But recently, that peace had been disrupted, not by burglars or vandals, but by something far more insidious, the HOA. The Homeowners Association, a group that was supposed to ensure the community thrived, had begun to overstep its bounds. What started as innocent suggestions for neighborhood improvement soon morphed into relentless demands for control. First, it was the lawn maintenance regulations, then the color of fences, then my mailbox, and each time, they seemed to have an ever-growing list of things I could and couldn't do. But it wasn't until they started targeting my garage that things took a dark turn. It started with a simple letter, one that I received on a Tuesday morning, just like any other. At first, I didn't think much of it. The HOA was always sending letters about one thing or another. But this one was different. It wasn't just about maintaining the front yard or parking in the right spots. It was a direct demand. They wanted the key to my garage. At first, I thought it was some kind of mistake. Maybe they needed access for some sort of inspection. Perhaps it was a mistake. But the tone in the letter left no room for misunderstanding. It wasn't a request, it was a demand. They wanted access to my property, to my private space, and they wanted it now. I'll admit, I was stunned. I had no idea why they would want to access my garage. There was nothing of value in there, no hidden treasures or contraband. But what I didn't realize was that the HOA had its eyes set on something far more valuable than I could ever imagine. What followed was a tense back and forth. Every attempt I made to get an explanation was met with vague responses. But I knew one thing for sure, they weren't backing down. The more I refused, the more they pushed. And then, one afternoon, they made their move. They came to my door, demanding once again for the key to my garage. I was angry, frustrated, and honestly, a bit scared. Who did they think they were? But as I opened that garage door, I had no idea that the next few moments would change everything. They had no idea what was waiting behind that door, and neither did I. It wasn't always like this. When I first moved into the neighborhood, I had high hopes for the HOA. I figured they were there to keep everything in check, to ensure the lawn stayed neat, the homes maintained a certain aesthetic, and the neighborhood felt safe and inviting. But somewhere along the way, things started to shift. At first, the HOA's presence was nothing more than an occasional newsletter and a polite reminder to trim my hedges. But as months went by, their requests started to grow. It wasn't enough that the lawn had to be a certain height or that we couldn't park on the street overnight. No, the HOA became more and more involved in the minutiae of my life. Suddenly, I was receiving notifications about the color of my front door, the type of grass in my yard, and how many holiday decorations were too many for the season. It felt as though every time I turned around, there was a new rule to follow. But it wasn't just the little things, it was the way the HOA handled these demands. They didn't politely remind you or give you a reasonable amount of time to comply. Instead, they sent threatening letters, sometimes with fines attached, for what seemed like minor offenses. One letter even came with an ultimatum about my fence. Apparently, the height was a few inches over what they deemed acceptable. The letter stated that if I didn't bring it down, they'd take legal action. And this was just the start. It felt like a battle of wills. Every time I refused or pushed back, they retaliated with something worse. It wasn't enough to just abide by the rules anymore. The HOA was trying to control every facet of my life, even if it meant using their power to manipulate and intimidate. The more I resisted, the more they dug in their heels, pushing for control over things that weren't their business. I had no idea what they were after, but I was beginning to feel trapped. The tipping point came when the HOA's reach started to extend beyond my yard. One afternoon, I received an email from them, another one of those vague, condescending notices that always felt like an attack. This one, though, was different. They were asking for the key to my garage. They claimed that it was part of some community safety inspection initiative. Apparently, all garages in the neighborhood needed to be checked to ensure they complied with some new, ambiguous safety code. I was confused and irritated. Why my garage? What could possibly be wrong with it? There had been no prior warning, no explanation, just an abrupt demand for access. It was as if they'd decided that my property wasn't really mine anymore, that I owed them access just because they held some vague authority. I had a million questions racing through my mind. Why were they asking for the key? What did they want to check in my garage? The more I thought about it, the more it didn't make sense. They had never inspected garages before, so why now? What could possibly justify this intrusion into my personal space? At first, I thought it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe it was some sort of error or a form letter sent to everyone in the neighborhood. But as I dug deeper, I realized it wasn't. This wasn't a mistake, it was their new rule, their new power grab. I tried to get answers. I reached out to the HOA president directly, asking for clarification. The response I got was curt and dismissive: the inspection is mandatory. Please provide the key by the end of the week. No explanation, no room for negotiation. It was as if they had already decided what was going to happen, and my opinion didn't matter. The pressure was starting to weigh on me. I felt like I was trapped in a game I didn't agree to play. The HOA's tone was always the same: calm, authoritative, and completely unwilling to consider anyone else's perspective. They knew exactly how to push my buttons, how to use their power to intimidate without ever overtly threatening me. They didn't need to raise their voice or issue legal threats. All they had to do was send a letter or an email, and suddenly, I felt like I had no choice but to comply. I started second-guessing myself. Was I being unreasonable? Why couldn't I just give them the key and get it over with? But every fiber of my being told me that this wasn't right. I had worked hard to make my home my sanctuary. My garage wasn't some community property for them to inspect on a whim. It was mine. The more I resisted, the more relentless they became. The emails turned into letters, the letters turned into phone calls. They began showing up at my door, demanding answers, expecting compliance. It was like I was no longer the owner of my property, I was just a subject in their little kingdom. Every time I said no, they pushed harder, until it felt like there was no escaping their demands. I began to feel like I was losing control of my own life. Every time I pushed back, it only made things worse. It was a never-ending cycle of power struggles. And at the center of it all, I was trying to hold on to my dignity and my rights as a homeowner. One morning, I received yet another email from the HOA. It wasn't the usual letter or reminder, this one was different. It was a demand, pure and simple: you must provide the key to your garage by 12 p.m. tomorrow. No pleasantries, no explanation, just a direct order. I was furious. How dare they? I'd had enough. This was the line. I wasn't going to give them the key. I didn't care about their so-called safety inspection. I wasn't going to let them waltz into my private space without so much as a reason. It was the last straw. But the pressure was real. As much as I wanted to stand my ground, the thought of further retaliation weighed heavily on me. What would happen if I refused? Would they escalate? Would they fine me, take legal action? It was like a battle between doing what was right and not knowing how far they would go. I knew they had the power to make things difficult for me, but I also knew that I couldn't let them win. I had to stand up for myself. I drafted a response, telling them, once again, that I would not be giving them access to my garage. I explained that I didn't understand why they needed it and that I had every right to refuse their demand. I hit send, my finger lingering over the send button, knowing that this would not be the end of it. What happened next, though, was something I never could have anticipated. The very next day, as I was finishing up some work around the house, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find an HOA representative standing there, not with a clipboard, but with a look of urgency. He demanded the key again, his tone more insistent now, more forceful. And then, the final twist: if you don't comply, I'll be forced to call the authorities. The situation had escalated beyond anything I could have imagined. I refused again, but this time, something was different. I had a sinking feeling that things were about to go south, fast. As the representative walked away, I realized the next step wouldn't be a simple letter or a fine. No, this time, they were calling 911. The atmosphere around me was charged with tension as I walked toward the garage. The weight of the situation had been building for days, but nothing could have prepared me for what was about to unfold. Every step felt like it was drawing me closer to something monumental. The HOA's persistent demands, the ever-tightening grip they had on my property, and now, the moment of truth: they wanted the key, but I had refused. The encounter earlier that morning had left me with an unsettling feeling that things were about to spiral. I had no idea what was waiting behind that garage door, but the way the HOA representative had insisted I open it, it felt like they already knew something I didn't. As I approached the door, the air seemed heavier. My heartbeat quickened, and a sense of dread washed over me. What was it that had caused the HOA to push so hard for access? Was it really just a safety inspection, or was there something more sinister at play? I hadn't had time to think about what was inside the garage since the request came in, but now, as I stood facing the large, steel door, my mind raced with possibilities. I had kept the garage mostly organized, a few tools scattered around, a couple of old boxes filled with things I hadn't gotten around to sorting through. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing worth raising an eyebrow over. Yet, as I reached for the handle, I felt the weight of the moment hit me like a wave. I paused for a second, taking a deep breath. What was so important that the HOA had pushed me this far? I turned the key in the lock and, with a slow, deliberate motion, opened the door. As the garage door creaked upwards, the immediate rush of cold air from inside hit me. The space was dark, filled with shadows, but nothing seemed out of place at first glance. Then, as the door opened fully, my eyes landed on the far corner of the garage. A few cardboard boxes sat there, but one was slightly open, and what I saw inside stopped me dead in my tracks. There, hidden under a tarp, were several large, unmarked crates. My heart skipped a beat. What the hell were these? I didn't remember seeing them before, and I was sure I hadn't stored anything like this in my garage. The boxes were sealed tightly, and the contents were hidden beneath a thick, dusty tarp. I had no idea what was in them, but the moment I laid eyes on them, something about the scene felt off. It wasn't just the mysterious crates, it was the sense of urgency in the air, the way everything seemed to take on a new, menacing energy. My hands trembled slightly as I approached the crates, but before I could reach them, I heard a sound behind me. The HOA representative had entered the driveway and was now standing at the open door, his eyes wide as he took in the sight. What is that?" he asked, his voice trembling. I turned to face him, confused and now equally unsettled. "I don't know," I replied, my voice sounding uncertain, even to my own ears. "I didn't put those there." His eyes darted between me and the crates, and I saw the color drain from his face. "You're telling me you don't know what's in them?" He stepped back as if he had suddenly realized the gravity of the situation. "We need to get the authorities involved, now." His voice, which had been assertive just moments before, was now filled with fear. His demeanor had shifted from demanding authority to sheer panic. The shift was so sudden, so complete, that I could hardly process what was happening. A moment ago, he was just another HOA representative pushing his weight around, and now he was practically cowering, his hands shaking as he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. I stood frozen for a moment, still processing the sight of the crates. There was something off about the entire situation, the way he was reacting, the way he insisted on calling the authorities so quickly. Was it just because of some random, unknown crates in my garage? Or was there something more to this? As I glanced at the crates again, the full weight of the situation began to dawn on me. Why hadn't I noticed these boxes earlier? I had been in the garage countless times, but never had I seen these before. My mind raced, trying to connect the dots. Who had put them there? Had someone else accessed my garage? And if so, why? I was starting to realize that the HOA representative's reaction might not be as overblown as I first thought. I glanced back at the man standing in my driveway, his phone pressed to his ear. He was speaking rapidly to the 911 dispatcher, his voice now filled with urgency. "Yes, I need someone out here, now. There are crates in the garage, and I don't know what's inside them, but it doesn't feel right. We need immediate assistance." As I heard the words leave his mouth, I felt a wave of disbelief wash over me. This was all happening so fast. I tried to tell myself it was just a misunderstanding, that it was probably nothing to worry about. But the more I looked at the crates, at the way the representative was acting, the more I felt a growing sense of unease. Suddenly, I wasn't just dealing with an overbearing HOA, I was in the middle of a situation I couldn't control, with forces I didn't understand. The authorities were on their way, and I had no idea what I was about to face. The tension in the air was palpable. The anticipation of the unknown hung over me as I waited for the authorities to arrive. What if these crates were connected to something more sinister? What if they were filled with something dangerous, illegal, or worse? My thoughts spiraled as I imagined the worst-case scenarios. The HOA representative stood off to the side, waiting for the police, but his fear was unmistakable. He wouldn't even make eye contact with me anymore. All I could do was stand there, staring at the crates, knowing that whatever was inside, things were never going to be the same again. And just like that, my once peaceful home had become a crime scene, with 911 on the line and the HOA calling the shots. The sound of sirens grew louder, and my stomach churned with anxiety as I stood in my driveway, staring at the crates in my garage. I could hear the approaching vehicles, the unmistakable screech of police cars coming to answer the 911 call the HOA representative had placed. The representative, his hand still gripping his phone, was now nervously pacing in front of me, not daring to look at me directly. His anxiety was palpable, his shoulders tense, his eyes darting around as if he were looking for a way to escape the situation he had just made worse. I, on the other hand, stood frozen, feeling the weight of the moment press down on me. I didn't know what was inside those crates, but something told me that the authorities would need more than just a simple explanation. They were coming here to find out if there was a threat, and if there was, who would be responsible. The first police car pulled into the driveway with a sharp screech, followed by another, and then a third. I counted at least 5 officers exiting their vehicles, their uniforms crisp, their movements swift and professional, but all of them looked confused as they took in the scene. The HOA representative, his phone now tucked into his pocket, was trying to explain what had happened, but the officers seemed unconvinced. They gave him wary glances as he rambled on about the safety inspection and how something didn't feel right. One officer stepped forward, his gaze locking onto mine for the first time. "Sir, could you please tell us what's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. I could sense the tension in his tone, the suspicion growing in the air. I took a deep breath, gathering myself before answering. "Well," I began, "I've been dealing with my HOA for weeks now. They've been pressuring me with requests to inspect my property, and this time, they specifically asked for the key to my garage. I refused, but they insisted. And when I opened the garage, this is what I found." I gestured to the crates, my hands slightly trembling. "I don't know who put them there, and I don't know what's inside them." The officer nodded, but his eyes flickered toward the HOA representative. "You say you found these crates in the garage?" he asked, his voice colder now, laced with suspicion. Yes, I replied. I've never seen them before, and I didn't put them there. The officer turned to the HOA representative, his eyebrows furrowing. And you called 911 because of this? You're saying you thought there was a potential threat in these crates? The HOA representative, his face flushed with embarrassment, nodded vigorously. Yes. I didn't know what to think. They were just there, and I didn't feel safe. It could be dangerous. We couldn't risk it. Another officer, clearly annoyed, spoke up. So, let me get this straight. You're a member of the HOA, and you've been harassing this man for weeks with ridiculous demands, and now you're calling us to deal with crates in his garage? Does that really sound like an emergency to you? The HOA representative's face reddened further, and I could see the wheels turning in his mind as he struggled to find a way to justify his actions. But there was nothing he could say. The officers were beginning to see the cracks in his story, and I could feel my own anger building up inside me. How had this spiraled so far out of control? All I had done was refuse to comply with a demand I knew was unjust. Now, I was standing here with police officers on my property, being accused of something I didn't even understand. The officer who had initially spoken to me turned back to the crates and stepped closer, inspecting them from a distance. He signaled for his colleagues to approach and began to question the HOA representative again, his voice edged with skepticism. Did you see what was inside these crates? Have you or anyone in the HOA checked them? The officer asked. The representative shook his head. No, no one's checked them. I didn't want to open them myself. I just thought it was better to call you guys in case it was something dangerous. The officer's expression hardened. So, you've been harassing this man about his garage for weeks, and now you're calling us to investigate something you haven't even looked at yourself? He turned to me. Are you saying you've had no idea these crates were here until today? Exactly, I responded, the frustration in my voice unmistakable. I have no idea who put them there or why. I haven't touched them. The officer gave a sharp nod, clearly starting to piece together what had been going on. All right, he said, turning back to his colleagues. Let's inspect the crates, and we'll see what we're dealing with here. With the tension growing thicker by the minute, the officers carefully approached the crates, their hands hovering over them as if they might explode at any moment. I watched their every move, my pulse quickening, unsure of what to expect next. They unsealed the top of one crate, their faces focused but calm, their movements deliberate. The officer pried the top open and peered inside. For a long moment, no one spoke. I could see the officer's eyes narrow as he peered into the crate. Then, slowly, he stepped back, and without looking up, he muttered, "You've got to be kidding me." Another officer moved in and took a look, his eyebrows shooting up in disbelief. "This is a setup," he said, his voice tinged with shock. "These crates are filled with old, used furniture and junk. It's nothing dangerous." I felt my heart settle, but the anger inside me didn't subside. I had been dragged through this unnecessary ordeal, only to find out that the HOA had called 911 over junk. It didn't make sense. One officer turned back to the HOA representative, his tone sharp. "You've just wasted all of our time for what? Junk? You had no idea what was in these crates, but you made a scene, calling us here for a potential emergency? What exactly were you thinking?" The HOA representative stammered, clearly losing whatever composure he had left. I didn't know. I thought it was suspicious. I'm sorry. I just didn't want to take any chances." The officer didn't seem impressed. "Next time, you might want to think twice before you escalate things like this." He looked at me, his eyes softening for a brief moment. "Sorry for the inconvenience, sir. This should have never gotten this far." I nodded, still processing what had happened. The situation had escalated so quickly, and I still wasn't sure how I felt about it. On one hand, I was relieved that the crates were nothing more than junk. But on the other hand, I was livid at the way the HOA had handled everything, how they had manipulated the situation to make it seem like an emergency. As the officers began to pack up their gear and prepare to leave, I realized just how deeply I had been affected by the events that had unfolded. The emotional toll was immense. I had thought I could trust the HOA to maintain order, but they had abused their power and nearly turned my life upside down. The feeling of betrayal lingered, and as the officers drove off, I couldn't help but wonder just how far the HOA would go next. And whether I could ever truly trust them again. The aftermath of the incident was nothing short of a whirlwind. After the police had left, the HOA was forced to deal with the consequences of their actions. The officers had made it clear that they had overstepped by calling them in the first place, and the HOA representative was left to stammer out an apology. I could see the fear in his eyes, not just because of the inconvenience he'd caused but because he knew this incident had put him in a vulnerable position. The HOA, once a powerful force in the community, now appeared weak, their authority shaken by the public spectacle they had created. The story of the false alarm spread quickly, and soon, neighbors who had previously been loyal to the HOA were questioning their judgment. It was clear that the HOA had miscalculated by turning a routine property issue into a full-blown emergency. The fallout was immediate, and there was no going back. As for me, I was left to pick up the pieces of my relationship with the HOA. The once subtle tension between us had escalated to an outright conflict. There was no going back to the way things were. I knew I couldn't simply give in to their demands, not after everything that had happened. The HOA had proven that they were willing to go to extreme lengths to control my life, and I wasn't about to let that happen. The key to my garage? They could forget it. No amount of pressure, no threats, no fine would make me comply. I had learned that standing up for myself wasn't just a right, it was necessary for my peace of mind. The decision to refuse was the easiest part, but the emotional toll it had taken was far more complex. After the 911 call, I had to reassess my own boundaries. What was I willing to let them control, and what was off limits? The HOA had blurred the lines between what was reasonable and what was invasive. It wasn't just about my garage anymore, it was about my home, my personal space, my right to live without fear of constant surveillance. They had overreached, and in doing so, they had violated the trust one had once placed in them. But the story didn't end there. The fallout from the incident had rippled throughout the community. More neighbors began to speak out, and many expressed concerns about the HOA's increasing authoritarianism. People who had once quietly complied with the HOA's rules now questioned the wisdom of giving them so much power. As the story spread, more residents began to realize the true extent of the HOA's control, and some even started to organize against them. I wasn't alone in this fight. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just my battle, it was a fight for the freedom of everyone in the community. If I had given in, I would have lost more than just control over my garage. I would have lost my autonomy, my ability to stand up for what was right. The HOA, on the other hand, quickly realized that their unchecked power was no longer accepted without question. They attempted to salvage the situation by offering another apology, but their words felt hollow, their promises empty. They could no longer deny that their authority had been exposed as fragile, and their attempts to regain control were met with resistance from the very people they were supposed to serve. They offered to review their policies, but I knew the damage was done. The HOA's reputation in the neighborhood had been severely tarnished, and the trust they once had was gone. In the days following the incident, I found myself reflecting on the lessons learned. I had faced a choice: I could have caved to their demands, given them the key, and gone on with my life as if nothing had happened. But I chose to resist, to stand firm in my belief that I had the right to protect my home. I had learned that sometimes, the price of peace is standing up for yourself, even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. The HOA had forced me to face the uncomfortable truth that I couldn't rely on authority figures to respect my boundaries, I had to do it myself. The HOA's overreach had sparked something in me. It was no longer just about my garage or my property. It was about taking control of my own life, my own decisions, and my own peace of mind. It was a lesson in resilience, in standing up for what's right even when faced with overwhelming pressure. I had learned that I could navigate the complexities of relationships, whether with a controlling authority like the HOA or with anyone else in my life, by holding firm to my values and refusing to compromise on my principles. But as much as I had learned, the battle wasn't over. The HOA may have backed down for now, but there was still a lingering question: what would they do next? Would they continue to push their agenda, or would they learn from their mistakes and respect the boundaries of the people they were meant to serve? And more importantly, how would I continue to stand my ground if they decided to challenge me again? The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: I was no longer afraid of the HOA. I had reclaimed my power, and whatever came next, I was ready. My journey with the HOA had been a wake-up call, not just about authority, but about standing firm in the face of adversity. It was a reminder that in a world full of control and manipulation, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to comply. And with that realization, I closed the door on the past, knowing that whatever came next, I would face it head-on, with the strength and confidence to keep moving forward. But that question lingered: what would happen next with the HOA? Was this truly the end, or was it just the beginning of a new battle? Only time would tell. If you've ever been pushed too far by your HOA, leave a comment below. What would you have done in my shoes? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more shocking HOA stories. You won't want to miss what's coming next.